You'll enter Boone Hall on the world-famous Avenue of Oaks, which is 5 years of history. At the end of the avenue, in front of the gate entrance to the Plantation home, the road bears off to the right, then splits. As the road splits, you'll bear left and follow signs there that direct you to the parking areas for passenger vehicles, RVs, and buses. Upon arrival at the front gate,
In 800 feet, turn left toward Oak Avenue.
That gives times and an overview of the different tours available during your visit.
That tour.
If you have any questions, Boone Hall staff members will be available on
those
the
are the
grounds to
dwellings,
answer
I
questions
think.
and give assistance. Restrooms are located inside the hospitality center, and restrooms with handicap facilities.
Turn left toward Oak Avenue, then turn right onto Oak Avenue.
Take off your mask, Addy. 1, 2, and 3. Okay. Ayun, hindi pa naka-close. 1, 2, I'm taking a picture.
Hi folks. How you doing? Are you heading over toward the tractor trailer? Yeah. Good. It'll be loading up probably 10 minutes. 10 minutes? Yep. There is shade over there.
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
Moana had a basket of fruit. Moana, this neighborhood. Oh, she has a basket with fruit and she said it looked like Moana.
Oh, yes. I remember that because I think I'm in touch with the Rwanda ladies right now in this basket. They want to look something like that too.
Are they pretty much making a basket?
These baskets.
Yeah.
Basket making has been a part of the Charleston
Yeah, grandkids and stuff. I think it's normal.
years.
And isn't it sad? History's failing, huh?
My daughter just picked it up. She just started.
Yeah.
She's doing fine. She knows how.
Very big round basket. That one is called a Fanta basket, and it was used when they were harvesting rice. Rice grows on a stalk, and where you find the grain of rice is right there at the end. Looking closely at the grain of rice, you see that it's enclosed by a husk. Most of the rice grown here in South Carolina was called Carolina Gold. That was due to the color of the husk itself. Had nothing to do with the grain of rice, which was white. But if they husk on the grain of rice when they shipped it across the ocean. By the time that rice got here, the side would be rotted. So in order to remove the husk, they would first loosen it up, they put the rice on the basket, they would throw it up in the air. The husk would be lighter, that would fly off, and the grains would fall back down to the basket. Now that's a very simplified version as to how the basket's used, a little bit more complicated than that, but the original purpose.
Inside these walls where you're now standing lived a family and sometimes a couple of families of slaves. Like many slave cabins across the South, the slave quarters were the center of their family life. When the slaves were not working, this is where they would be. These specific cabins here at Boone Hall date back to the late 1700s, early 1800s, and have been maintained in very much the same condition as they would have been in the 19th century. What you're seeing here is how a slave cabin may have been furnished. However, some of these cabins would have had dividing walls separating it into 2 or 3 rooms. The survival of these cabins can be largely contributed to the fact that they were made out of scrap bricks from the brickyard located here on the plantation. These cabins would have housed house servants and the more skilled laborers as they were located closest to the big house. The field workers lived in the wooden cabins that would have been closest to the fields. There are none of the wooden cabins remaining here at Boone Hall. It was illegal in the South to teach slaves to read and write, but history reveals that there were slaves who were able to secretly learn on their own, usually with the help of someone on the plantation. However, it has been documented by the South Carolina State University History Department that Boone Hall was one of the first plantations to teach their slaves to read and write. After the ban on importing slaves in 1808, slave owners realized they could find stolen to the facility, so slaves had entangled with struggle in the earth, and sometimes even Much of what we know about the slaves themselves and their lives are from the stories passed down through generations, or from the slave owner's perspective, inventories, and census records. Very few slaves' written records exist, as most of them were not able to read or write. Just in recent decades have researchers begun using archaeology to study the lives of slaves. One of the biggest mysteries nagging archaeologists about slaves is nutrition. How in the world did slaves work those long days, depending on the job to be done, were assigned to each slave, and a slave was free to leave when that work was done to the driver's satisfaction. As one planter put it in his overseer's contract, a daily task load is the amount of work the average slave working industriously could accomplish in 10 hours. When slaves completed their task for the day, the rest of the time was theirs, although they still remained the property of their master. Boone Hall used a combination of the 2 systems, depending on whether they were in the fields or maybe making bricks in the brickyard. Workers would spend 12 hours a day in the cotton fields and longer during harvest. Men, women, and children worked, with children considered half-hands until they were 12 years old. In the winter months, the slaves would make bricks in the brickyard, and Boone Hall's brick and slave labor constructed many buildings in Charleston. It became very commonplace for slaves to be hired out from Boone Hall, as well as other plantations for construction projects and other services in town. Because of the amount of work that was being done in town by slaves, Charleston developed a slave tax to identify and tax the services of hired slaves. On display in the slave cabin exhibiting archaeology is an original slave tag that was found there. The physical demands that were forced on slaves goes beyond